Welcome to the Dean's Corner this afternoon. We have a very special guest for you. It is Dean Emeriti and current professor Gerardo Gonzalez. And we're going to be talking to him today about his new book titled A Cuban Refugee's Journey to the American Dream, The Power of Education. Welcome, Dean Gonzalez.
Thank you, Len. Nice to be here.
It is such a pleasure to just have read your book and to have been a part of it. And it was so powerful. Help me understand why you wanted to write this book.
Well, I was asked by President McRobbie to be sort of an ambassador to IU to Cuba. Mm-hmm. And unexpectedly, I received a call from the Alumni Association to take a group of alumni there almost 50 years after I had left Cuba. And it was something that's always been in the back of my mind,
Sure.
you know. I mean, you never forget your place of birth and still have family there, but it was something I was driven to do because I grew up here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And going to Cuba for the first time, all of a sudden I found myself having these emotions and memories that just came floating back that I didn't even realize I had.
Sure.
And so I, at that moment, realized that I needed to start jotting some of these things down. And then that led to conversation with my parents, who, I was very fortunate. Both had lived to ripe old age, and my father unfortunately passed away last year at 91. My mother's still living. But it gave me a chance to sit down with both of them.
Sure.
And ask them questions that I probably never would have had I not begun to think about telling the story.
Sure.
And, things, in some cases that I heard throughout, some things that I remembered that they were able to expand upon. Some things, like what were the motivation for leaving Cuba? What were some of the most difficult things about leaving Cuba? Circumstances surrounding the trials and tribulations of immigration once we got here. And I did set out to have the book be a commentary on current issues.
Sure. Yes.
It was more of capturing the emotions, the feelings, the memories that I now began to want to share. And as it turned out, what I found in this process was that those events and the emotions and the motivations that surrounded my immigration to the United States and our life as refugees are very much at play today.
Yes, they are.
And so it was, even though it was not by design, the book ended up being, I think, in some ways, a commentary on some of the current issues like family separation, the anti-immigrant fervor, the role of underrepresented students in schools. These are timeless issues, but I'm glad that what started out to be just a personal story, and I hope that still is, has also ended up being a statement that I hope will open up doors for others and help people to gain a deeper understanding of what that immigration experience is like, and what those of us who are underrepresented and especially poor, because we came here with nothing. When we left, we left everything, and so that's how the book evolved.
Well, I really enjoyed how you weaved in your personal narrative, but with detailed stories, and how you weaved in your experience with different organizations, and how you talked about your family and that experience, and all along the way, the lessons that you learned. So let me tell you what I mean by that. When I think of hands, and your father's hands, and the way that he held them up to you and said, look at my hands and what that means, that was so powerful that I think, that metaphor and what that means for any child today is so relevant. Could you tell us how you felt when he held his hands up to you?
Oh my goodness, Len. Yes, of course. I told that story in various forms over the year because not only did it impact me, but I hope it is a story.
It impacted me.
Well, it's something I hope will give insights into what parents, particularly parents who are not educated, do to motivate their children to have a better life. Because even though my parents were not educated, they knew that the sacrifices they have made in leaving Cuba and their families, they were doing it for their children, and if we were going to have the opportunities to make those sacrifices worthwhile, we needed to get an education. So my father was an auto mechanic all his life, and that's what he loved doing. I mean, when I think of the importance of being passionate about what you do and how much of a difference that makes and how well you do it, I think of my father because even though he was a simple mechanic, he was a world-class mechanic and took great pride in doing that. And that's what he had been doing all his life since he was a child, 12 years old. He told me he had started working on cars and fixing cars and so forth. But if you've been around someone who is a mechanic, you know that their hands take on a very distinctive look.
Oh, yes.
20, 30, 40 years or more of getting cut in radiator fans, getting burned with hot engines, grease getting under your nails, gasoline taking its toll on your skin. They take on a very distinctive look.
For sure.
And you know that anyone who had lived that kind of life had lived a life of hard labor. And so my father's way of motivating me to get an education was, as you said, put his hands in front of my face. And he would just say, look, Hera, look at my hands.
Sure.
I want you to get an education so that when you're my age, your hands don't look like mine.
Right.
And I didn't always understand what he was trying to say, especially being a young child, although I sort of got the message. But as I grew older, and I realized, the power of education. And here's a man that I love who loves me. And even though he couldn't guide me to education, he didn't know anything about SATs or FAFSA or any of those other terms associated with going to college. But he knew that education was important if I and my sister were going to have a better life. And all he knew was being a great car mechanic, but he knew that's not the kind of life that he wanted for his children. And so that was the way that he impressed upon me that the importance of education. And so throughout the years, as opportunities arose for me to eventually get through high school and then go to college, I often thought about my father's hands and the image they conjecture and why, if I fail or something, I wasn't going to just give up. I was going to learn from that and move forward. So that's the story behind that. And to this day, I think about that. And when I share that story, I hear so many young kids today, some of our own students, who say, "Oh, it reminds me of my grandfather. It reminds me of." My father.
Sure.
And there's a narrative there. I'm going to digress a little bit, but there's a narrative out there, as you know, that Latinos, Hispanics, minorities don't care about being involved with children's schooling. They don't show up at PTA meetings. They don't call the schools. They don't always know how to check on grades. Those things that those of us in middle class families sort of take for granted. That's what we do.
Yes.
And so it's easy to formulate an argument or conjecture an idea that if you're not doing those things that are expected of middle-class society,
Yeah.
showing up at the kids' school, parents' days, those things, that somehow you don't care.
That's right.
And the reality is that, I think all immigrants make the sacrifices they make for their children. And whether they're educated or not, they know that education is the door of opportunity for those children, and they try to motivate them in ways that they know how. And it may not always be coming
That's right.
to an APTA meeting, but the motivation power of those interactions with my fathers and the image of his hands were as great as any kind of a grade or report card or encouragement that I might get
For sure.
in a more traditional way. And so I think it's important that we recognize and realize that parents, even if they're not showing up for those school meetings, care deeply
Yes.
about those kids' education, their kids' education.
Yes.
And we as educators need to understand the apprehensions, the limitations, their ability to express that in traditional ways, and maybe reach out to them and make them partners in the effort, because it is such a powerful message.
Sure. That's so important, because I thought when your father took you back to school after you asked your friend Jose,
Oh, gosh.
you asked him a question and the vice principal saw you and took you out, and then you went home and got a spanking, and your dad took you back to school. It showed how important
Oh, yeah.
it was for you to be in that school, but it also changed you in a way. Can you talk about, I guess, how connecting with schooling affects children and parents and the whole intergeneration, and how that affected your development?
Yeah. Well, I need to give you a little bit of a context for that story, because it was
It's an amazing story.
It was a truly transformative story. I mean, I had no idea at the time, how much that particular scenario that you just described impacted me. Not just at that time, the time it was happening, but throughout my career, my educational endeavors, and even to this day. So here I am, a kid, 11 years old, didn't speak any English. All of us, were coming here, all
Yes.
the Cuban immigrants were
Yes.
coming here. We all wanted to get settled in South Florida. Most of our families, those of us who have any idea what was going on, why we were, coming to this new land, thought that, we would be there a short time, maybe a year, 2 years, then the Castro Revolution, which is what we were all
Yes.
trying to escape, would fall, and we all go back. And so all those hundreds and thousands of Cuban kids,
Yeah.
or other Latin American, mostly Cubans, who were arriving daily in Miami and settling, created a tremendous problem for schools. Because schools, first of all, had no idea, how to deal with kids who didn't speak any English,
Yeah.
who were culturally different, who were loud, and they were trying different things. They wanted to be responsive, but they honestly did not know how to deal with it. So they were trying different things. So the first thing they tried, which ironically today has been suggested as well, is what we think of as the swim or sink approach, right?
Yes.
So just put them in the
Yes.
schools.
Yes.
They'll learn English, interacting with other kids.
Yeah.
They'll read the books, or
Yes.
at least be exposed
Yes.
to the books, and eventually they'll learn enough English and move on. Well, that didn't work. You put a bunch of kids, and first of all, the other kids were laughing at us, and so we were the subject of ridicule and so forth. When the school realized that wasn't going to happen, they tried, bilingual education programs, where they were taking kids in regular classrooms, and then they put them into English classes and try to teach them in their native language. I ended up in one of those bilingual classes, and it was a class of all Cuban students, or at least all Spanish speakers, vast majority Cuban, with a Spanish teacher who, bless her heart, wanted to help us, understood where we're coming from, but was having a real time managing the class. You know, here you are a group of, I don't know how many at that time, it had to be probably 30, 40 Spanish-speaking kids. All of us, you know, trying to adjust, talking with our hands, which we do anyways, and we're being loud. And sure enough, the classroom got the reputation for being a class of troublemakers.
I see.
And so the vice principal, in charge of discipline, you know, got a whiff of that. And he was a rather, you know, a traditional, conservative-looking guy, and he wasn't going to have anybody disrupting his school, his traditions, and so forth. So he set it upon himself to come to our classroom and set us straight. And so I remember that day vividly. I mean, as we're talking here, Lem, I tell you, I can see what this man was wearing. This is not, you know, a faint memory by any means. The teacher warns us, says, you know, all right, you guys, you better be on best behavior. The vice principal is coming to our class today, and he wants to have a talk with you about behaving. Remember that this is America, and you have to act like American. None of us knew what Americans acted like, you know, let alone, you know, what was expected of us. So the principal comes to the class, and because we're all shaking and we're already afraid before we even walked in the class, you know. I mean, the teacher sort of put the fear of God in us anyways. Comes into the class, he's standing in front of the class, and he's angry, he's banging at the desk and pointing fingers and talking loud. Well, I knew he was serious, but I had no idea what he was saying. You know, so I'm sitting in the back. I'm sitting in the back of one of those rows here, you know, like everybody else is kind of shaking. And I knew this, whatever it was he was saying, he was taking it very seriously, and I better try to understand. So I turned to one of my friends in the class who spoke better English, and I said, Jose, ¿qué dice ese hombre? You know, Jose, what's that man say? At that point, the principal rushes to where I'm sitting in the back of the class, literally grabs me by my arm, pulls me out of my chair, takes me to the front of the class, still holding my arm, stands me there. He's literally shaking me and pointing at me, and basically I learned later, telling the class, this is what I'm telling you. If you don't respect authority, if you don't know to be quiet when others are speaking, you are going to be suspended like this kid who obviously has no respect for adults and so on. And again, reiterating, remember, this is America, and better behave like America. Pulls me out of the class, takes me out of the classroom to the office, and proceeds to suspend me from school. Calls my mother, who spoke no English either, and tried to tell her that I've been suspended. You know, she said, well, you know, you're going to have to call his father. He speaks more English. So I don't know if it was him or one of the assistants in the office at that point calls my father and tells him that he needs to come pick me up because I've been suspended from school. Well, you know, my father obviously is from the old country. And you know, in those days, you know, respect for authority was something that was expected, and especially in our culture, but in our home. And so he didn't have to get the details of what I had done or not done. He knew that I must have done, in his mind, he knew that I must have done something terribly wrong to be suspended from school. And he knew, or at least felt, that if that were the case, then all the sacrifices that he and my mother had made so that we could have a better life were going up in smoke. And so get this, Lem, he was an auto mechanic. He was working. So what do you think he does? He takes an old tire and calls a strip out of that tire. And he couldn't come pick me up, but he arranged for me to be picked up and taken home. And so when I got home, he proceeded to punish me very severely, to the point where my mother said, after years later when I was talking to her, fue un bruto, he was a brute. Even the neighbors had to intervene. So he didn't say, let's sit down, tell me what happened.
Yes.
It didn't matter.
Yes.
I mean, from his point of view, it was ruining my life and everything that they had done. And the only way he knew, just like he wanted to motivate me to get education through his hands, he knew that he needed to send me a strong message that misbehaving and disrespecting authority and failing in education was not going to be acceptable. So I got severely punished. Well, I tell you, I learned a very important lesson that day. I learned to keep a mouth shut. And so from that day on, I'm a middle school kid now. I never participated in class discussions. I never engaged learning in any meaningful way. I mean, I was not a troublemaker. I was not truant. I would go to school. I sat in the room, follow rules when I understood what they were, or pretended to understand what they were. But I never engaged by way of raising my hand, asking a question in class, And pretty soon the system just began to forget about me. I became invisible in that massive South Florida system. And the long and short of it is that throughout the years, teachers who in many cases were well-intentioned figured that I was not college material. And instead of encouraging me or helping me, get out of that rut that I was in and inviting me to participate, at some point along the way, I was tracked into vocational education. Now, mind you, those days vocational education is a lot like today where you have advanced manufacturing, computer. This was a place where you went if you were in college material, right? And pretended to learn a skill or something. So I ended in being tracked into vocational education, and by the time I got to high school, all I wanted to do was just get out of there and get a job. I had no intention. I didn't know at that point what college was. And even though the image of my father's hands was still vivid in my mind, I could not see myself continuing education. I mean, education was something to leave behind at that point, not something to get more of. And so, my intentions were to go to work in a clothing store. I had a part-time job, which was part of a co-op program where I was getting actually high school credit for working at this school. And, I dream of one day maybe being a manager and perhaps even owning a store, but, college was the furthest thing from my mind.
Well, let me ask you, I know Mr. Levine story, and that's very important, but I thought you taking time in the one chapter to talk about your place when you all left Miami and went to Pittsburgh, and you were still quiet, but you found your place of comfort in the chapel, given the fact that you were going to Catholic school. And I thought you just taking the time to put that in there is so important, because I think people forget that, yes, intellectual is important, family is important, but just something spiritual helps a child in a way that cements them. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure, well, so, after the first year in Miami, because the economy was so, depressed anyways, and my father trying to find work, they made the decision that we would go someplace where there were jobs. I mean, all my father wanted to do all his life, really, but especially during those early years as an immigrant, find a job, provide for his family. I mean, that was all he knew how to do, and that's what opened doors. Well, because of all those Cubans that were congregating in Miami, the federal government established what was called the Cuban Relocation Program. And the Cuban Relocation Program was a program where any Cuban who wanted to go elsewhere in the United States would be assisted through the Cuban refugee program to get to the place where they could use their skills and put them in contact with local charities that could help. So my father shows up in the Cuban Refugee Center and says to the guy I learned later in one of our conversations, I want to relocate my family. And he said, well, that's great. We'd be glad to help. I said, where would you like to go? He says, I don't know. I don't care. I just want to go someplace where their job, with this industry. Mm-hmm. Well, he's got this big book of destinations, and I guess he opened it up and said, something that said industry, put his finger on it, Pittsburgh. Now, this is February, mind you.
Please tell them about cars. There's so many good stories in this book.
This is February 7th to be exact. So here we are, Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah.
And I'll get to your story in a minute about the church, but we're landing, and I remember I was so embarrassed because the only coat that they could give me was a hand-me-down green woman's coat. And so, I wasn't going to put that damn thing on coming home.
You look very dapper with it.
Well, I don't know about that. So I didn't want to wear the damn thing. So get to Pittsburgh, and I remember approaching the airport, and the flight attendant comes on and says, remember to put on your coats, it's 5 degrees below zero. Well, hell, I had no idea what 5 degrees below zero meant. And those are, you don't pull up the tarmac, you stop and then you descend.
Yes.
And when they opened those doors, it was such a blast of cold air, my ears started freezing. I grabbed that green coat, put it on in a heartbeat. But they put us up on these projects, basically, government subsidized house, with the assistance of Catholic charities, because that was the main charity that was helping students. So they found a way to get my sister and I enrolled in a private Catholic school in the outskirts of Pittsburgh, a community called McKees Rock. And I still didn't speak any English, and very few people there spoke any Spanish. But the nuns who ran the school very much wanted to make us feel welcome and support us. And so what I started to do is, my sister and I would walk to school. And as soon as I got there, unless we got there early, I go to the chapel. It was a place that provided comfort. It was quiet. It sort of allowed me to be myself. I wasn't worried about somebody bullying me or criticizing me or what a teacher might do. It did bring spiritual calmness, if nothing else, right? But I do this all the time. So, in the morning before classes start, then at lunch, if I want to go to lunch, I had extra time, I'd go to the chapel. Then after school, before my parents could come and meet us, we could walk home, I'd go to the chapel. So, I'd be in the chapel for hours in any one day. Well, lo and behold, at the end of the semester, even though I was still lost, I still didn't understand everything was happening, I get this little mimeograph note in blue ink. There's, mimeograph, the old stuff that you run to the mimeograph machines. And all it said is, your son has been promoted to grade 7, I think. Sister, which is her name, principal.
Yes.
And so I'm sitting there looking at this note, and all I could think to myself is, this is a miracle.
You went to the chapel.
My prayers have been answered. But the struggles continue there, Lam, and we never did adjust to Pittsburgh. And even though it was an industrial city and huge steel mills, they were all shut down too. There was a national recession. Yes. So my father never did find work there, and so after a few months, I think probably we got there in February. By May, we were on the way to New Jersey. And that's where I first began to sort of come of age and, found a sense of community. There were other kids who spoke Spanish, and developed some friendships, began to understand the teachers and schooling and so forth. before we settled back in Miami, because my mother developed allergies and became ill, and so we weren't able to stay there.
Yeah. Well, that was a very good story, and I think in New Jersey you said you started to talk again, and boy, did you keep talking.
Oh, yeah. I made up for all those hours in the chapel. Wait a minute, I got something to say here.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about Mr. Levine and your fashion sense and your goals there, because I thought that was a beautiful story.
Yeah, so we settled back in Miami. All of us apprehensive. My mother and my father, they still remember, the difficulties of that initial year. Of course, the school scene and the vice principal was very vivid in my mind, and I was very apprehensive and scared of going back. When I got there, as I said earlier, I really was not engaged in school, and ended up being tracked and ended up then getting this job with Marvin Levine, who really developed in those years what was probably one of the best in the country, boutiques. Really good clothes, and so I liked that fashion, and I just saw myself, like I said, becoming a manager, maybe someday owning my own store, and I began to talk with him about doing that, because he was going to expand his business. And he invested very heavily in taking the small boutique they had and replicating it on a grander scale in another area of North Miami. And so my thought was, I'll go to work for him in the new store, maybe I can manage this one. We had all the ideas. Well, that summer, that was the summer that I graduated from high school. And I thought, great, finally, now I can blossom, not have to worry about school anymore.
Yes.
And go to work. Well, there was another recession in the country, and Mr. Levine went bankrupt. They closed the store, and he had to let me go. And so here I was, summer of '69. No real preparation for jobs except for the retail experience. No real education. No idea what college was. The Vietnam War was raging. And I was in despair. I didn't know what I would do. I mean, my whole dream of owning a fashion store and making it a living in that field crumbled. And fortunately for me, a friend from New Jersey who was now attending the University of Puerto Rico, Raphael,
yes,
was visiting me. And, he was probably my closest friend at the time, and I just said, Raphael, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm in despair. And he said, almost a passing comment, said, Gerardo, why don't you go to college?
Yes. College.
What's college? Really? I had no idea what college was. What was college? Yeah. And he went on to, explain the experiences he was having and the great ideas that he was exploring, and made it sound very exciting. So, well, sign me up. Well, I can't sign you up, but there is a community college here in Miami that has an open door policy. You may not have use of it, but
sure.
Go there and check out their admissions and what you have to do to get in, and so I did.
Yes.
So I went to Miami-Dade, what was then Miami-Dade Junior College, to the Miami-Dade College, and I said, I want to go to college, and the lady said, well, what do you want to do? I have no idea, but I know that education has always been important in my family, and if I can go to college, then I want to do that. She was very helpful, helped guide me, and because I had a high school diploma, even though it was a co-op, vocational diploma, all the community college at the time, and as I think is still true today, those who stay true to that mission, have open door policies. Sure. And so people who might not get admitted to a selective institution like Indiana University or the University of Florida or any of those selective institutions can get a start. And so I I enrolled in Miami-Dade College, and just as Rafael has said, once I started experiencing the transformative power of education, and I started learning about things that I had no concept of, I realized that I wanted more. That's what sparked my thirst for learning. And sure enough, after some remedial work and just getting by, initially I began to hit a stride and ended up doing very well. And then transferred to the University of Florida, where I got my bachelor's in psychology. I ended up staying there, getting my master's, a specialist, and a PhD. And then they had the little sense of inviting me to stay on the faculty. But they did. But the reason I say that, Len, is because, oftentimes people think that if you don't go to college because you have no academic ability, right? Or somehow you're not college mature, you'll never be able to do it. And the reality is that I could have very well ended up who knows where.
That's right.
And once I was given the opportunity, and I was supported, and I was exposed to real learning and the great ideas of humankind, and the opportunity to be myself, I started to blossom. And not only did I get my first associate degree and then bachelor's and master's and all those other degrees, but I was passionate about education and learning and all that entailed, because it changed my life. And so I was invited to stay on, first in some administrative roles and then on the faculty. And so the fact that I had been attracted to vocational education had nothing to do with academic ability.
That's correct.
Nothing to do with academic ability. And I was able to obviously succeed in that role, and then actually Florida invited me to assume some other administrative role, including becoming chairman of the department I graduated from without ever being in the place. Then associate dean, and then the last year I was there.
You had to choose.
I was interim dean, and they offered me the dean's position at the same time that Indiana offered me the position there. And so it's a very unusual career trajectory.
It's wonderful.
But I'm very grateful for the opportunities that both Miami-Dade College and Florida gave me, and I'm also very happy to be here at IU. I think it was the right decision at the right time when I opted to accept the deanship here.
Well, you've had a wonderful career here at IU and continue to go forth. And when your friend encouraged you to go to college, sometimes all we need is that someone to speak it, and so it is. And you used another metaphor in that story that I think you're very good at doing as you write this book here. You said it was 1969, a man had landed on the moon, and you walked into this office and you felt like you were on the moon. It was just so foreign to you, but that risk and what it became, and then finding mentors throughout your career. I think you mentioned Dick and Carol, who were faculty, good mentors for you, and then as you just weave on throughout this book and end up with some best tips that you sort of leave in the end of your chapter. I don't want to give everything away because I want people to buy the book, but can you just tell us lessons or share with us, the best lessons learned and that you can impart to alumni and students who are listening and faculty, what lessons you've learned?
Well, going back to Armstrong's comments about taking a leap, he had just landed in the moon, and I may be paraphrasing, but he uttered something like, a small step for man, a giant leap for mankind. And so when I entered that community college door and decided I'm going to do this, even though I had no clue what I was about to do, I felt like I was taking a leap, and I think that's language that I use in the book. And so one of the things that I tell students today is that you have to take risks. You can't always be where it's safe, and you sometimes have to trust serendipity, because except for an off-chance comment from Rafael and then the encounter with people who
Yes.
helped me along the
Yes.
way, you know, I might not have been able to persevere.
Sure.
And so taking that leap and not being afraid to fail, I think was an important lesson for me, and one that I hope others can take away from the story. But the other thing is, in college, particularly white institution for
Yes.
underrepresented students, that sense of community becomes very important,
It does.
and oftentimes difficult to find,
Mhm.
as was the case in those years at the University of Florida for me. But what made the greatest difference was finding faculty who became mentors.
Sure.
And in one case, again, it was a kind of a coincidence.
Mhm.
A new faculty member had arrived. He was from Colorado, and spoke Spanish, loved
Yes.
Spanish culture.
Yeah.
I was a student in psychology, just getting started in the major. And through a mutual acquaintance, I was introduced to him, and he loved speaking Spanish with me, would
Mhm.
eventually have me over to his house with his
Sure.
colleague, and we became more than student, it became more than a student-faculty relation, it became a mentoring relationship, a friendship. And to this day, as I look back on those days, had I not had a mentor like Dick Swanson, that's his name,
Yeah.
I probably would have done as many other of my friends from Miami who went to the University of Florida with me did, and that is just after the first semester or sooner,
Yeah.
drop out and go back. But what kept me there, in part was that image of my father's head, but the other part was that mentor and being able to connect and feeling like I was doing something. He ultimately supervised an independent research project, which is in a topic of interest to me, and that helped me, move along. So I just cannot overemphasize how important those connections
Yes.
are, and mentoring in particular for young students, particularly those who, are not always able to find communities that are ready-made for them.
Yeah. Well, what I love about your book is that undergraduates can read it, graduates can read it. It's a policy book, it's an international book, it's a book about the power of education and how we need that today more than anything else. And so I just want to thank you for spending the afternoon with me and sharing yourself and your stories. And I would encourage all of you to go out and really pick up a copy of this book. It's wonderful. Dean Gonzalez poured his heart out and shared his life with us. And I just want to thank you again for being a part of
Thank you, Len.
this wonderful opportunity.
What a great conversation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.